It's amazing that from this particular era in church history, out of which came St. Patrick, so much of what we know of Patrick of Ireland is legend, not likely verifiable by history. In contrast, one of his contemporaries, St. Augustine of Hippo, has a great deal written about him and by him. And yet, we see an entire culture, and in fact many other cultures throughout the world, celebrating Patrick of Ireland and what he stands for as a symbol of evangelization, not just for the people of Ireland, but for the whole world. We always like to look at various exceptions in history. I'm a particular fan of the YouTube series Crash Course, and when they had Crash Course World History, virtually every episode and every subject, they would state a historical rule, such as Hitler and Napoleon learned the hard way that you cannot attack Russia during the winter. Then he named the exception, unless you are the Mongols. Talking about Christianity, he would talk about the Roman Empire, the Jews living in relative religious freedom, except when they learned that in empires you cannot really live in true religious freedom unless you are, wait for it, the Mongols. Somehow the Mongols are the exception to many examples and many rules throughout history. But in some ways, the Irish are as well, at least with regard to church history. Maybe not the exception, but certainly a number of firsts. For example, the Irish were the first culture to receive evangelization and embrace the faith without a war or a foreign conquest. It would stand alongside such cultures as Korea, which is the only culture that evangelized itself, not from missionaries, but itself, from its own people. But Ireland was the first in the history of the church to receive the gospel without a military conquest. And we know how saturated with Christianity in general and Catholicism in particular Ireland's post-Christian history is. Ireland was the first to bring us many aspects of a new spirituality that incorporates some of the appropriate spiritualities from the Druid culture out of which it came. For example, the connection with nature. Long before St. Francis of Assisi preached to the birds and proclaimed brother, sun, sister, moon, and the animals being our brothers and sisters, the Irish had a sense of a kinship with all of creation. And part of Irish spirituality is the connection with an animal of sorts. Many of their greatest saints somehow had some either symbolism or connection with an animal, be it a horse or a bird. St. Brendan had the whale. And we see some of that brought also in such works as we see in Harry Potter. The characters who are connected or have some companionship with an animal, whether it's Hedwig the owl, Trevor the frog, or Fawkes the phoenix. We see elements of that Irish spirituality that perhaps comes from the Druids, but nonetheless was conducive to a Christian identification with nature. Coming on the heels of centuries of persecution in which we saw many Christians shedding their blood as part of their witness and sacrifice for Christ, on the heels of which many Christians wanted to sacrifice in other ways when martyrdom was no longer a factor and persecutions had ceased, they had gone from red martyrdom, which is the giving of one's life, the shedding of one's blood, to what's called white martyrdom, which is giving up the luxuries and the comforts of society to retire to the desert, which in that is the origins of monasticism, which was also very strong in Ireland. In Ireland, they faced a problem. There wasn't much of a persecution, and in case you hadn't noticed, not many deserts either. A very lush, green island nation. But from the Irish came what has come to be appropriately known as green martyrdom, in which part of the Irish spirituality is to give up one's homeland, the tremendous love they have for their home, and to travel, to learn what they can about the world in which they live, and bring what they learn back to their home, back to Ireland, with that enrichment of those who have traveled. And we see that in the classic journey of the mythological and legendary heroes. The call from their home and coming back greater than they were, more knowledgeable than they were, with a great boon for the society that they had left. And it is in that spirituality of travel that we see many of the Irish Christians collecting the great works of antiquity and preserving those works in the monasteries of Ireland during the tumultuous times of the barbarian migrations and infiltrations of Roman culture. And while the church in Europe held things together socially and politically, culturally, much had been preserved by the Irish monks who had traveled to see the world, or at least the European world, and preserved so much of that in the Irish monasteries. And that is told very eloquently in Thomas Cahill's work, How the Irish Saved Civilization. We also see the Irish as the great adapters. True Christian form, adapting to their circumstances in order to live, just as the gospel adapts to its circumstances in order to preach. Even as recently as the 1800s, when the Great Famine hit Ireland, in no small part because of the tensions and persecutions and problems with the occupying British forces, at one time Ireland's greatest export was its people, who left Ireland to get away from the famine, to find prosperity and life, and in some cases freedom, somewhere else. And we know that in this country, and especially in our church, we have been blessed with the Irish immigrants. Many of the priests we remember, as much as we love to complain about the foreign priests today, whose accent we can't understand, the U.S. has always been a missionary church that has relied on foreign-born priests to keep the church going because we have been so bad at providing our own vocations. And one culture that has done wonderfully in providing vocations have been, at one time, the Irish. And we couldn't understand what they were saying either. Even at times I'll hear people complain because they can't understand the Filipino or Vietnamese or Mexican priest's accent, and they're telling me, Father, you have to talk to Father Juan. We can't understand the accent he's saying. We don't understand a word he's saying now. This is actually a true story in which I told this woman, you're right, the only accent we like around here is the Irish one. But believe it or not, in the Irish language, there is no word for immigrant. The word is exile. The word is exile. And in that word, there's always the sense, or at least the expectation or the hope, that one day they will come home. But so many of them did. They found a home where they settled. One story is told of an Irish man who immigrated to the United States and eventually found himself in Butte, Montana, where he worked as a copper miner, where he started his family, earned his living. Eventually we moved from there to another location where he would see his children grow and his grandchildren grow. When finally he was coming to the end of his life and he was in his declining years, his family gathered around him. They asked him, "Where would you like to be buried?" His response was simple: "Take me home and bury me in Butte." Butte, Montana, where he eventually settled and made his roots, his family, his living. The ultimate adapters, to even the point where you will see artists, politicians, leaders, authors, even in South America, South Africa, other parts of the world, with Irish names, because of the Irish that has traveled to so many parts of the world and ultimately made it their home. And with them brought a faith that is undying, even as it battles some of the growing secularism in Ireland today. Ireland is known and is synonymous with the Catholic faith. Granted, it has its Protestants in the north, and there's always that rather charming rivalry between the two, and in some cases, a very violent one, if we remember the images from the late 70s and early 80s. But it was Patrick and his contemporaries who gave Ireland that faith that will never die. And in that, we see some very basic aspects of faith that fit us just well in this era in which the last three popes are calling on us to a new evangelization. What's the story of Patrick? A young man who perhaps was born in Wales, kidnapped by pirates and sold as a slave in Ireland, spending the better part of 6 years as a slave shepherd, scantily clad in an era that is not known, in a territory that's not known for its warm weather, eventually escaping and taking that rather precarious trek out of slavery, escaping Ireland, only to have a desire to go back and preach and bring salvation and that gospel to the very people who enslaved him for so long. Not only do we see a message of evangelization in that message, but as we just hear announced last week by the Holy Father, another year dedicated to the theme of mercy, we see in St. Patrick a man of very deep forgiveness. Not only did he forgive those who enslaved him, the culture that enslaved him for so many years, but he desired very deeply to bring them the gospel that would lead them to salvation. We think often of preaching the gospel always, and when necessary, use words. Perhaps long before St. Francis said that, St. Patrick raised the ante. Preach the gospel always, and when necessary, to those who have hurt you. Who are we called to forgive in the up-and-coming year of forgiveness, year of mercy, as we continue to enter into the efforts of the new evangelization? How do we call on Christ to be that great strength of our faith, even in the midst of the pagan forces we see in our society even today? Patrick is said to have expelled the snakes from Ireland, which symbolized the Druid pagan culture of that country. And there are indeed many snakes of a pagan culture that we see in our own society today. Do we find ourselves preaching a conversion message to those pagans of our day today, to forgive those who persecute us, who look down upon us because of that faith that we profess? And how do we call upon Christ to be that great strength over and above all other saints, all other forces we might call upon for help, and against all forces that would seek to threaten us or diminish that faith that is our own? Perhaps the best expression of that is found in yet another legend of St. Patrick as the author of a great prayer. If he did not write it, it has his stamp all over it. Appropriately, it is an Irish voice, a voice of one who wept for slaves, who rejoiced in creation, and who called upon Christ himself for that protection, who outranks even angels and saints that we seek to pray for that protection. He takes it to Christ himself, and not just Christ, but invoking the greatest power we have. It's appropriately also known as the deer's cry, because he sets himself very much as a deer in the scope, a deer being threatened by hunters, but knowing that ultimately it is Christ who protects him with that great power that he calls in the mighty name of God. I arise today through a mighty strength, the invocation of the Trinity, through the belief in the threeness, through confession of the oneness of the Creator of creation. I arise today through the strength of Christ's birth with his baptism, through the strength of his crucifixion with his burial, through the strength of his resurrection with his ascension, through the strength of his descent for the judgment of doom. I arise today through the strength of the love of cherubim, in obedience of angels, in the service of archangels, in the hope of resurrection to meet with reward, in prayers of patriarchs, in predictions of prophets, in preaching of apostles, in faith of confessors, in innocence of holy virgins, in deeds of righteous men. I arise today through the strength of heaven, light of sun, radiance of moon, splendor of fire, speed of lightning, swiftness of wind, depth of sea, stability of earth, firmness of rock. I arise today through God's strength to pilot me, God's might to uphold me, God's wisdom to guide me, God's eye to look before me, God's ear to hear me, God's word to speak for me, God's hand to guard me, God's way to lie before me, God's shield to protect me, God's host to save me, from snares of devils, from temptations of vices, from everyone who shall wish me ill, afar and anear, alone and in multitude. I summon today all these powers between me and those evils, against every cruel, merciless power that may oppose my body and soul, against incantations of false prophets, against black laws of pagandom, against false laws of heretics, against craft of idolatry, against spells of witches and smiths and wizards, against every knowledge that corrupts man's body and soul. Christ to shield me today against poison, against burning, against drowning, against wounding, so that there may come to me abundance of reward. Christ with me, Christ before me, Christ behind me, Christ in me, Christ beneath me, Christ above me, Christ on my right, Christ on my left, Christ when I lie down, Christ when I sit down, Christ when I arise, Christ in the heart of every man who thinks of me, Christ in the mouth of every man who speaks of me, Christ in the eye of every man who sees me, Christ in the ear of every man who hears me. I arise today through a mighty strength, the invocation of the Trinity, through belief in the threeness, through confession of the oneness of the Creator of creation.